In his book, The Pac-Man Principle, Zero Book's author Alex Wade argues that the Pac-Man is a quintessential subject under capitalism. Pac-Man, alone in a maze, is isolated in a world not of his making. Instinctually, he begins to eat and to avoid danger. Wade writes, viewed in this way, it is possible to see how Pac-Man becomes a poster child for capitalism. He's indiscriminate because he's naive, but he learns from experience. The Pac-Man is the ideal consumer, formed of universal need in the crucible of a labyrinth. He becomes the ideal learner-worker to be deployed within the state of nature of capitalism. But this consumer creature will turn back on his aggressors when given the opportunity.
And welcome back to BaffleGab. Now we have a very special guest. We have Professor Alex Wade, who is a senior research fellow in the School of Education at Birmingham City University in the UK. Now he's written a book for Zero Books called The Pac-Man Principle, a user's guide to capitalism. Now Alex, when Lenny first gave me this book and told me to read it, I was like, I'm sure there's going to be some PC nonsense about how Pac-Man is sexist. Why did Miss Pac-Man take his last name? Why can't she just be a Pac-woman? And if not that, it was going to be some book about how we all got to switch to an all-cherry diet. But your book is actually more complex than that. Can you give the listeners a breakdown of what the Pac-Man principle is?
Yeah, the Pac-Man principle is about the fact that Pac-Man is a game that's been around for like 40 years, and he's now appeared on every different video game platform around. And I think it was time that we kind of try to understand what Pac-Man is and where he's coming from. And he exists in this kind of ultra utopian conservative space, which is a state of nature where you eat or be eaten. I think that's really the kind of place a lot of your listeners would love to live within, I guess. But it's really about what can Pac-Man survive in this kind of space, and it's about him being hunter or hunted or haunter and haunted. If you talk about the ghosts that he's kind of been pursued by throughout, and a lot of the time we kind of talk about the where society meets the idea that the welfare state is there to help us out, but increasingly it seems the case that another kind of paradigm exists in terms of a right-wing paradigm where the welfare state's less and less important. But if you read the book, it's really about the fact that this kind of thing is necessary, not just for the survival of the right wing, but actually for the survival of capitalism. Full stop.
Wow. That's really interesting, especially using Pac-Man as an allegory for capitalism, because the way I think of capitalism is more like Frogger. You're trying to cross that road. You're trying to get the dream job, trying to be successful, but obstacles keep crashing into you. Student debt, crash. Now your wife wants an annulment, crash. Your grandma dies, crash. That seems to better represent the soul-crushing capitalist dystopia to me. So I'm just curious, what it is about Pac-Man that you think is so analogous to capitalism.
Well, I think the fact that Pac-Man can't escape. So if you play the 1980 original, you get to level 256, and the designers of Pac-Man thought at that point, well, no one's ever going to be good enough, but everyone who knows who plays video games, you either try to finish it or break it. And effectively, what happened was, on level 256, you can't get out of that. So the maze kind of disintegrates into a bunch of symbols, and the best thing that Pac-Man can do is just bounce his head up against the kind of brick wall. So I think that's really becomes a kind of allegory for capitalism. You reach those limits of capitalism, and you keep on, banging against them, and you find other ways to kind of that capitalism infests our lives. So people have written about this, and the only place that it's not in is our dreams at the moment. So it's the only place it hasn't managed to take over. So that's why I think Pac-Man is a good allegory for capitalism in that respect.
Wow, it seems very like heady and sort of abstract look at capitalism. So what I usually do is I try to teach my kids about capitalism through Monopoly, and when they lose, I make them sleep outside for the night. That seems to be like a more grounded way for them to learn about how to survive in capitalism. But so, is there a way that I can change this up? Because also, I like Monopoly because it's more of like a board game that we can play together in our hands, and they're just not having their face stuck in a screen. Is there a way where I can explain sort of these limits of capitalism and that you need to survive or you're going to die?
Yeah, I think what you've got to do with your kids, I mean, you can either put them in the garage, which might give them some help in terms of, not being exposed to the elements. But Pac-Man's all about eating pills, and we know that, health services are great on giving out pills to people to control the way they think. So that's what I would recommend, that you go out there and you give them as many, mind control pills as you possibly can.
I'm already shooting my kids up with a lot of Ritalin.
Oh, okay, well, that's great. I mean, that's a great starting point for this. This is exactly where we should be going. And, and then, building other kind of SSRIs into that and antidepressants as much as you can as well.
That's right. Well, that's the American way. Any problem in your life, there is a pill to fix it. Yeah. So I want to actually fast forward to the end of your book, spoilers. Sure. So you end it by going into time versus space, with space being the realm of capital. You write, as a product of capital, code shows the limits of space, pushing beyond the code. The human spirit shows the possibilities of time. So code here is referring to both the code and the game, the inputted computing rules, and also the rules and barriers that modern capitalist society is held in place by. So can you tell us a little bit about how to break through this code and what that would entail? Is there an equivalent of a Konami code for upending capitalism?
Well, we would hope that would be the case. I mean, I have to be honest, I'm not completely kind of averse to the idea of capital when it's used in correct ways. So if we have markets are good in the sense that they do bring prices down, and they can also help with competition. So I'm not completely averse to some of the good elements of capitalism. But what I'm talking about here is that earlier in the book, I give quite a few examples of when the human spirit is actually tempering those excesses of capitalism. So if you think about the time in the 60s when we're on the brink of nuclear war, it wasn't machines that effectively run on this code that were stopping us from going to war. It was, the good sense of the two Ks, so Khrushchev and Kennedy. So these were effectively, two relatively left-wing people making good judgments about capitalism. And it's about, making sure that we have the human spirit at the heart of everything that we do, I guess, and not leaving that behind in the race just to make money. So I think that's really the thing. And it shouldn't be about survival, people on the gig economy. It should be about, thriving within this. And I think that's the most important part, is giving humans an opportunity to talk and to communicate properly about these ideas.
Well, with this idea that on the final level of Pac-Man, he leaves the player and breaks through the code, it starts to sound very similar to the 2015 Adam Sandler film Pixels, where Pac-Man and other 80s video game characters come into the real world to attack us. Is this something you started to fear as you wrote the book?
I think we've got to fear these kind of things. So, one of the most famous games of all time, and probably the most instantly recognizable, other than Pac-Man, would be Space Invaders.
Yes.
And this was, during the 1970s. This was really about the idea. It wasn't just the idea that our spaces had been invaded by video game machines, but this was Japan taking its revenge on America for all that, for the Marshall Plan. So can you imagine that the Marshall Plan was put in place? Well, there was a different plan for Japan, but in Europe there was a whole welfare state put in place by the kind people in America, and then eventually this came and bit them on the bum, as it were. And what happened was Japan started to take over America, and I guess we can say that those have never been, those jobs have never been replaced. All the electronics industry went abroad in many respects, and America paid the price for helping out other nations. And Trump's got it right now, he's doing the right thing, not helping anyone else go in isolation. It's a good idea.
Yeah, That's right. I think that might be the first time I've ever heard Trump is doing the right thing on this show from somebody other than Ralph.
Well, that's true. And I think also, you do have to kind of go it alone. It's kind of similar to, I want to talk about the PlayStation 2 game, Katamari Damacy, where you're just collecting things. It's like every person for themselves. You're a prince, and you're pushing around this giant ball, right, where you're just like collecting things, and they just keep
cows, street signs, trash.
So it just grows larger and larger objects, into your ball. Everything is like just being cummed in there until it becomes just a giant star. It's bigger than the Earth. You've like accumulated all of the resources, and then you're going out into space to sort of like get them, right? I think you mentioned like the gig economy. This is sort of the Silicon Valley idea of just endless growth. Yeah. And it's like, if Trump wants to like go it alone, that's how we're going to do it, is by growing larger and bigger until we have all of the resources. 100% market share.
Yeah, like Walmart.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so we're talking, a lot of this stuff can be very scary. And one of my fears is dirty words. So when I started reading your book, I actually had to put it down at about page 3 where the word coochie appears.
Oh, yeah.
So I couldn't leave this book around the house now. My kids, or God forbid my wife, may pick it up and see this tasteless word. But apparently this had roots in aspiring Toru Iwatani. That's correct?
That's correct.
Right. Known for his cameo in the 2015 Adam Sandler film Pixels. Yeah. Inspiring him to create Pac-Man. Can you tell me a little bit about how coochie is connected to Pac-Man?
Yeah, so the origin story for Pac-Man is that he comes from a pizza with a slice taken out, so that's an easy geometric shape to make a kind of a relationship to. So you take one slice out, and that looks like Pac-Man. And there was I think there was an interview that Iwatani did with Susan Lammers in 1986, and he discussed that. But actually, the real origin story is that it comes from coochie, which means opening in Japanese. So the symbol is a hole, and it doesn't necessarily just mean mouth. It could be mouth or throat, or it could be stomach, or it could be the sphincter, for instance. So it's all of those kind of things. It's been a symbolic culture. That's how it's presented. And Pac-Man is effectively that opening and going around and chomping things like that. So in Japan, what happened was when the US servicemen were there, they used that word coochie, and it's now used as a slang term for female genitalia. I think in America, it's not used in the UK, but that's because it's specific to the Japanese, the American occupation of Japan following the Second World War. So that's where the two links come from. So the origin isn't dirty, but it has been misappropriated over time.
Gotcha. A shame. Another casualty of war is that it's pushing dirty slang back into our language.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears for a moment. In your research, and I was just this was a burning question as I was reading your book. Were you able to discover if Miss Pac-Man, which many people consider to be the superior version of Pac-Man, is that just Pac-Man in drag, otherwise known as a palette swap, or is she real? I think that the only thing that's different about Miss Pac-Man, I think, is the fact that it runs a little bit quicker than the original Pac-Man, and all she has is a ribbon on there, and on the cabinet she's crossing her legs in a feminine defensive manner, and that is basically it. Pac-Man was originally, envisaged to appeal to women as well, and obviously it was so popular with women because it's about eating, not just because women eat, but because everybody eats. So it was good for children and women as well as men playing Space Invaders and blowing things up. But it was so popular that obviously the next thing was Miss Pac-Man. But it wasn't the first video game that had a woman character in it. I think there was an earlier one than that, whose name escapes me. But other than that, it was a brutal
and quite cynical cash in, I would say.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So outside of, that Pac-Man was a break from all this sort of kill the alien type games, your book actually doesn't go in that depth to more of the classical political debates about video games. So I just want to throw this out there. I'm for banning video games simply because school shooters seem to like them. But if there are going to be a tool to kind of teach kids to break the chains of capitalism, as it seems that your book is like putting out there, then that's great. That's another reason to ban them, I think. So, but video games are all about play, right? So they're not supposed to make people think, really, about like work and their like place in capitalism. It's supposed to be just a mindless free time after you clock out. But, there's this like, it's kind of like anti-work play is, right? So it's like, now you have people going to work and they're playing Candy Crush while they're on the clock. So is there a way to sort of have people play video games and disguise it as work? So let's not use video games to break through capitalism, but, let's try to reinforce it. What if people were playing Farmville, but they're connected to robots who are actually doing the farming? Is there a way to not let the player reach the end of capitalism, but instead find a way to bring capitalism and video games closer together?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there I'd like to talk about. So since the crash in 2008 and the recession that followed on from that, The Economist did some research.
Yeah, thanks Obama. Sorry, not to interrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks Obama. Yeah. So after the economic crash was caused there by the left-wing government, what happened was that young men came out of the labour force increasingly, and they didn't return to it. And instead of returning to work and using their time in a productive manner, they actually started playing, in-depth, video games, RPGs, The Witcher and things like that.
Right.
Because there's more element of control in that, and those people have never gone back to work. So we're a decade down the line, and there's a whole host of a lost generation of young men, especially in America, but in Europe as well, that have never gone back to work. The same in Japan with the hikikomori. They get their food put under the door, as flat pack food, and that all happens there. And the thing about that is, they can dynamically control the lives that they're in, so they have some control over their lives, but the rest of the time they don't have a great deal of control over what they do. But I think the question really is, when you go to work and you're working on a spreadsheet and you're typing all those points and things like that, is it really that much different to playing a video game? If you've got how many emails you can get through in a day, that's really about point scoring as well, how quickly you can respond. Video games have become kind of a kind of leap for capitalism in many ways. Like we live in a ludic economy in many ways, I think.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a concept in, I guess marketing, but other things as well. Gamification. I don't know if you looked much into that in your research for this book, but it really has taken off as a concept for, mostly like consumer purposes, but others as well. Like pretty much every app and major website has some element of gamification.
Yeah, and I think that, the thing is, we want to make everything fun for people. So do we want to make like exams like games, and education? Does it need to be fun to be useful? And that's the question. So even when you go and use an ATM, for instance, there's a kind of gamified aspect to it. You can get points from that and put your money into charity and things like that. And everything becomes gamified. So yeah, that's increasingly the case. But the worst thing about these are that they're putting on kind of game mechanics onto things that aren't already games, and effectively it just makes them like busy work in a game or grinding something out in a kind of Japanese RPG or something. It just feels like work plus, if you like. So you've got to, more like ordering Uber or something is a bit like that, isn't it? It's just more and more work, basically. But it feels like that anyway.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that as someone who, I don't enjoy video games, but I do enjoy Excel sheets. And so I do sort of like this idea of thinking that Excel sheets and getting these emails out as fast as they come in is my video games.
And pretty soon, we'll all have jobs like, Amazon warehouse workers, where they have automated software-based managers that time their every movement, bathroom breaks.
I'm sorry. Yep, you're a low-scoring employee. You have to go.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the deeper political implications. You say that in the book, you say about Pac-Man that tourism inverts into terrorism, that Pac-Man is the tourist wondering and wandering, and the ghosts are the terrorists that haunt, trap, and kill within the same system as Pac-Man. Now, I get pretty angry when I'm on vacation, but I certainly want to avoid becoming a terrorist. So can you explain a little more about what you mean by tourism inverts into terrorism?
I mean, that is a kind of is slightly contentious, but what really is happening there is that when they go hand in hand. So if you think about, I know it's a sensitive issue, and it's probably even more sensitive when a foreigner would talk about it. But if you think about 9/11, 9/11 is based around the idea of mass transit, and mass transit was only really something that came around in the late 20th century. So you have this kind of spread of aviation that happens, Pan Am onwards, if you like, and the use of tourists. People could go to different countries and do different things like that. And really, without that kind of thing in place, terrorist attacks would never be possible. And the way in which that was broadcast, across the mass media to the watching masses, it is all about that kind of, bringing masses together, and that's what tourism is about. So if you go and you're touring around a country that you're not familiar with, and you're doing that en masse, then effectively you're exporting your own culture onto that. And you see that, there is a widespread criticism of American culture, soft power throughout the world. So McDonaldization, for instance, comes from the idea that you export, McDonald's to every country that you go to. So there is that reverse aspect of terrorism that isn't necessarily to do with spilling blood, but it is to do with the kind of cultural terrorism that goes on in that respect. So it's not meant to be blasé, and I did say that in there, but I think that a lot of the way in which terrorism is constructed now could only happen within a world that allows us to travel so far, so quickly, and with so little fuss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. We gave you Big Macs. You can at least just be grateful for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, get those beef burgers. Yeah.
But you talk about like the UK politicians in this sort of terrorism realm, where they started to use referenda to sort of get responses that they wanted, or at least expected, from the voting public. And that within this, they kind of lost control, right? You say they started standing for things that they didn't believe, and that this sort of climaxed into the UK referendum to leave the European Union, Brexit for our slower listeners out there. And now you say you call this the first real political event to happen to the UK in decades.
Yeah.
Would you like to take a second now to thank the Conservative voters for making that happen?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely great that the Conservatives did this, and the older people who have had all the benefits of being in the European Union, free trade, and being able to have lower priced goods that are imported from poorer countries and get all the fruit and veg from over there. And all the old people, they all voted to come out, so they had all the benefits of it, and then pulled up the drawbridge and left, and that's what happened. So yeah, absolutely, Conservative voters were instrumental in that, and we've got to thank them for the absolute stench that they've left behind.
It actually is a lot like Pac-Man, right? So the older voters were sitting there eating cherries with no ghost, and now they've unleashed the ghosts.
Yeah, they have ghosts, yeah. And we've all got to kind of either run away from them or confront them. And, as everyone knows, it's easier to confront things together as a trading bloc, or if you're in NATO, than it is to do these things alone. You can't do it alone, not in a globalized world. But this is the reality.
Well, I wish you luck. I wish UK the best.
Yeah, and I haven't really been following it that closely, which I'm sure is not a shock to you. Americans are very insular and ignorant about what else is happening. Last I heard is like, the debate between soft Brexit and hard Brexit. What do you think's ultimately gonna happen? I'm just curious.
Well, we're hearing more and more rhetoric around that. We're gonna just fall off a cliff in April, on April 1st, which is April Fool's Day, and and there's going to be no deal in place. People weren't even aware of the fact that if you don't have a deal in place, then all of the aeroplanes would be grounded, the ports all back. There'd be no food coming into the country through ships because there'd be no tariffs in place, and there'd be no logs for that in place. So if you get to that point, that the hard Brexit, which is you fall off a cliff, that is an absolute disaster. But in all honesty, the alternative that we have in terms of soft Brexit is not something that anyone wants either. So I think it might get to the point where it's so extreme that we do fall off a cliff, or we go back and have another referendum. There is an increasing desire, I think, for another referendum to vote on something. Do we stay in the EU? Do we have a different plan, or do we just go straight out and fall off a cliff? That might be the question that is put to the people. But again, I don't know. I mean, it's no one knows from week to week. The government don't know what they're doing, so it's the people are even more clueless, I'm afraid.
Well, if it's any solace to you, our own president didn't even know what the term hard Brexit was when asked a question.
It's of no solace at all, because we always look to America, as being the leader of the free world, and what has happened there is, I would suggest, more disastrous than what has happened in Britain.
We'll be fine.
I would agree. It is far more disastrous.
I'm sure. You'll survive. You're a country that survives. But
we'll make it to level 256 in America.
Well, I think Trump is probably the last president of the American Republic. Maybe the first president of the American Empire. We will see.
Yeah, that's very possible. Yeah.
We're gonna make it to the kill screen. Don't worry.
All right. So our last question for you, Alex. What's your favorite video game of all time? Because it can't possibly be Pac-Man, right?
Well, so why would you say it can't possibly be Pac-Man?
It's just so simple.
Yeah, you're just eating pellets and cherries.
They've got Call of Duty and stuff now.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's something that isn't that much old. Well, it isn't much. It's a bit younger than Pac-Man, but it's Outrun. So Outrun is a racing game by Sega, which was which I thought was about America, but it's actually, when I've done some research into that, that's what I found out. It's about Europe and driving through Europe, but it looked like America to me, and that kind of sold me on those ideas of America that we kind of grew up with in the 80s, that it was an ideal place to be, and it was wonderful. And I think that really, those rolling hills and the palm trees and all that, it was really gorgeous to play that game. And I still play it. Well, I don't play that game, but I play iterations of it today. But at the moment, I'm playing a game called Quantum Break, which is really good as well. It's about time machines and shifting through time and stuff. So yeah, Outrun, I would say.
That's cool. What system is Quantum Break for? I'm curious.
Say that again, sorry.
What system is the video game you just mentioned for?
Yeah, it's Xbox One, that is. So it's only available on Xbox One, yeah.
I agree with you. America was great in the 80s. And don't worry, we're going to go back.
Yeah. and the best decade. The 80s was the best decade, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I love Outrun, but I got to say, there's a special place in my heart for Hard Driving. You ever played that game?
Yeah, Hard Driving. That was amazing in the sense that it was a game that, was the first one to have kind of polygon graphics like that. And it actually made, driving a normal car effectively, not apart from the loop, but in a normal way, actually made it fun, which was a real achievement at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is like a full 4 frames per second, too. So, at the time, it was like the real thing.
Yeah.
Well, you fellas have fun. I'll be playing Cruisin' USA.
Yeah, that's a good game as well. There you go.
All right, well, I want to thank our guest, Alex Wade. His book is The Pac-Man Principle, A User's Guide to Capitalism. It's available now from Zero Books. He's the Senior Research Fellow in the School of Education at Birmingham City University, UK. Alex, thank you for being on the show.
And Alex, do you have something you'd like to plug, social media accounts or websites?
I'm going to be honest and I say I don't do social media, I'm afraid. So I've got nothing to plug in that respect. But if you'd like to buy my book, it's very cheap. It's a great book to read on an aeroplane journey from within the USA or across Europe or something like that. So yeah, if you'd like to buy it and it's cheap, have a look at it and see what you think.
All right, cool,
perfect. It's a great book. So social media is the one game you're not playing.
I'm not playing Twitter or Facebook, no, or Insta or anything like that. No, I'm too old for that.
All right. Well, thanks, Alex. It was a lot of fun. Really appreciate it.
Great. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. Okay, coming up, we have another installment of Baffle Gab Heroes, and you're going to want to stay tuned to hear it. You're listening to Baffle Gab, and we will be right back after this brief musical interlude.